I'm so close to finishing this. Look at this. Proud. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime. Crue Trime. It's Crue Trime in net. My name is Sarah, and what I do here is tell you a terrible story to ruin your day and put in my makeup at the same time. So if that sounds supremely weird to you, and you're also weird, then you're in the right place. So make sure that you subscribe to this channel, turn on the notifications, and then that way you'll never miss one of my terrible stories. So today's terrible story is highly, highly recommended. Be careful what you wish for, friends. This is one of the most horrendous and infamous cases in the history of Great Britain. Oh yeah, we're going across the pond today, friends. This is the story of Fred and Rosemary West. All right, I got a feeling that this one's gonna be very, very long because I got a lot of notes, so hope you have a snack. On February 25th, 1994, the Gloucester police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, England, and they knocked on the door, and the lady of the house, Rosemary West, answered, and the many police officers that had gathered outside informed her that they were looking for her daughter, Heather Ann. She'd been missing for years and years. Rosemary made excuses and said Heather was off in another town dealing drugs with a boyfriend, so she certainly wasn't at home. The police that were waiting outside her door had a search warrant, but it wasn't for inside the house. It was for the back garden under the patio. So a few months earlier, Rosemary's husband Fred had been arrested on accusations of child abuse. And this led to the 5 youngest of the West children to be taken away from the home and placed in the care of social services. Now, that case was eventually dropped, but it did bring some disturbing things out into the open. Apparently, while the kids were in care, it came out that there was this family joke, and it was Fred's way of keeping the kids in line. He would say, "You better behave or you're going to end up in the garden under the patio too." Actually, I think more of what he said was something like, "You're going to end up 2 across and 3 down like Heather." So the back patio was like brick pavers, and it kind of looked like a crossword puzzle, the way that it was arranged. 2 across, 3 down, you get it? Anyway, yeah, so it was a family joke, but the kids actually did believe that their sister, Heather, was buried under the patio. So the Deputy Chief Inspector, Terry Moore, decided to apply for a search warrant based on this probable cause because of Fred's earlier arrest. The police moved in on the house and they decided to dig up the garden, but Moore said that he didn't really believe that they were going to find anything. You know, that there was any truth to this family joke. So they got to digging. And they weren't really finding anything. Well, remember when the police showed up, Fred was not home. So when he came home from work and he found out what was happening, he first was upset that they were messing up his garden. But then he asked the police if he could talk to them down at the police station. So at first he gave them many credible stories and ideas as to where his 18-year-old daughter Heather might be. He said that she had started dealing drugs and had fled to Dubai with some girl in a red miniskirt who was like her lesbian lover. The point is, she wasn't coming back. So they were just wasting their time and ruining his garden. Moore said that it seemed like Fred was just, giving them excuses to, stop digging. But the police continued, of course. When the officers came back to dig on the second day, things had changed drastically. Fred had actually confessed to murdering his own daughter, Heather.
What?
So Fred's confession was like kind of matter of fact, you know what I mean? Casual. Saying that he didn't really mean to wrap his hands around her neck to kill her. He only meant to grab her around the neck to shake her. Which, what's the difference? I don't know. But anyways, after Heather died, he dismembered her body and then buried her under the garden patio. He offered to take the police back to the garden patio to find her because where they were digging was the wrong spot anyways. I can't overstate how casual this was. This was his own daughter and he was like joking. Jovial. Okay, so Fred was arrested straight away and he was assigned legal counsel, Solicitor General Howard Ogden. The next morning, the police took Fred back to the Cromwell house where they indeed found human remains. Forensic pathologist Dr. Bernard Knight analyzed the bones and he determined that one of them was the leg of a female victim. But in their excavation, the investigators actually found 3 femurs that belonged to 3 different victims. So the investigators went back to Fred with what they'd found, and Fred then revised his confession to add 2 more victims, saying, "Oh yeah, that's Shirley and her mate." Couldn't quite remember the mate's name. You know that there's a dead body in your backyard, but you don't know the name of the person? What? Spoiler alert, he definitely knew who these people were. So by the time they were finished digging, the investigators had found pieces and parts of these 3 bodies. And while they were at it, they decided to excavate the entire garden. They also expanded that search warrant to go inside the home and dig up the cellar, where they found more than they bargained for. But as this went on, Fred was very clear to the investigators that he acted alone. His wife was none the wiser, had no idea what he had been up to at their house.
Sure, Jan.
So, who was Fred West? I'm glad you asked. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29th, 1941 in Bickerton Cottage, Muchmarcle in Herefordshire, England, to Daisy and Walter West. His mother, Daisy, had suffered many miscarriages before her little miracle Fred was born, so because of that, Fred was clearly favored by his mother, and she was very overprotective. The West family eventually grew to 6 children. They were incredibly poor. They lived and worked on a farm, with the children doing farm chores of all kinds. Fred was a terrible student, and he likely had a pretty significant learning disability that was undiagnosed and untreated. He was known to fight with the other students and bully them, and not surprisingly, his father was very aggressive with him and his siblings, beating them regularly. Fred ended up dropping out as a teenager, not that he'd ever had a strong attendance record. Later on, Fred would say that his first sexual experience was at age 12, when his mother invited him into her bed to lose his virginity.
Instantly, I was like, yeah, no.
His father would encourage him to have his way with the farm animals. Like, you know what I'm talking about. Like, bestiality things.
Yeah, immediately no. Immediately no. Immediately no.
Fred claimed that he learned about sex because his father was also raping several of his sisters. I mean, it also goes without saying that Fred definitely was molesting his sisters as well. These interactions between mother, father, sister, brother, in Fred's eyes was totally normal. Weren't all families like this? Didn't everybody do this?
Yeah, no.
So by 1957, 16-year-old Fred and his little brother John were spending a lot of time at a youth club in Ledbury. The girls were not really into Fred, but that didn't stop him from walking right up to them and groping and grabbing them. He had no impulse control, no boundaries, and no understanding of how his actions affected others. For Fred's 17th birthday, he got a motorcycle, and just after his birthday, he was in a terrible, horrific accident and suffered a major head injury that put him in a coma for several days, and he ended up with a metal plate in his head.
Well, see, the plate runs right underneath my part.
He was actually hospitalized for over a month, having broken several bones, including his legs, and then he had to wear braces on his legs for months. So 2 years later, after this accident, Fred was again at the youth club, and this time he was on a second floor fire escape with a young girl. By this point, he's like 19. This girl was maybe 12. He was aggressively trying to grope this young girl, and she fought back. She punched him, and he lost his balance and fell down 2 stories to the pavement below, causing yet another head injury and brain damage. Fred was already not a quality person, but his family and friends noticed a marked difference in his personality. He started having very angry outbursts, and he had previously been a pretty calm person. So once he recovered from that fall, his 13-year-old sister Kitty told their mom and dad that she was pregnant, and it was Fred's baby. He, as I mentioned, had been molesting and raping her for over a year, and, she became pregnant. Fred was arrested, and he freely admitted to the police what he'd done. Remember, he's like, what's the big deal? Everybody does this. This is normal. Well, Fred's mother was prepared to testify in defense of her son, but the case ended up falling apart when Kitty refused to take the stand against her brother. But Fred was put out of the family home, but later reconciled with them. I just find it rich. Like, the mom did what she did, and the dad was doing what he was doing, and but they're gonna banish Fred? Okay. Anyways, during that year that Fred was out of the house, he actually lived with an aunt on the other side of town. And while he was there, he reconnected with an old girlfriend, Catherine Rena Costello. She went by Raina. So Fred and Raina had dated for several months before she moved away to Scotland with her parents, and Raina now was pregnant. She had an illegitimate child by a Pakistani bus driver. And this was quite the scandal because not only was she a young single gal, unmarried, this baby was going to be mixed race, which was just frowned upon. And it was also the reason that Raina had been sent away from Scotland. None of this was a problem for Fred, though. Raina and Fred actually got married on November 17th, 1962. On February 22nd, 1963, Raina's daughter, Charmaine Carol West, was born. But because they were afraid of this mixed race backlash, Fred and Raina came up with this wild story that Raina's actual baby was stillborn or she had miscarried. So they adopted this mixed race baby to, help heal Raina's grief. They later moved to Scotland, and then a year after that, Raina gave birth to another baby, a girl who was fathered by Fred, and they named her Anna Marie. So as the girls, these little toddler baby girls, were getting older, Fred actually rigged their bunk beds with bars on the front of the bottom bunk to make a little baby jail. And they weren't allowed to leave the baby jail whenever Fred was in the house. So not great. Anyways, so Fred and Raina both stepped out of their marriage at times. Fred was the first one to stray, and then Raina got him back. Fred had lots of affairs, actually. Raina carried on a long-time affair with an older man named John McLaughlin. And one time, Fred actually caught Raina together with John, and he tried to fight him. Fred was such a coward when it came to fighting men, but he sure didn't have a problem beating the shit out of Raina and his daughters. When Raina would come to John with marks, black eyes and such from Fred, John would go beat the shit out of Fred anytime he saw him. Not a super stable relationship or environment for this young family. Anyways, in November of 1965, Fred accidentally ran over and killed a small boy in his work van. It was declared legitimately to be an accident, but the boy's family was so angry at Fred, they accused him of doing it on purpose. Did I mention that Fred was an ice cream man? Sorry if I left that part out. Yeah, when the ice cream man runs over a kid, it's game over. So essentially, Fred was run out of town. So they relocated back to England, and they were accompanied by a couple of their friends who were seeking work. They were neighbors, Issa McNeil, who sometimes worked as their nanny, and local teenager Anne McFall. Okay, so fast forward to 1966. The West household was a mess. Fred's physical abuse towards Raina had spread out to Issa, and by this time, he was carrying on an affair with teenage Anne, and he was sexually molesting Charmaine. He wanted Raina to get into sex work to support the household, and she didn't want to do it, so Raina devised a plan to escape. With the kids and with the help of her old boyfriend, John McLaughlin, and Issa's boyfriend, John Trotter. But when she told Anne about this plan to escape the oppression of Fred, Anne told her that she intended to stay behind to be the nanny for the children, to work for Fred. If Raina is leaving with the children, there's no nannying necessary, but okay, so the Great Escape did not happen as planned. Fred would not let the children leave. It was a whole dramatic scene. Raina did get out with Issa and John. But the kids stayed behind with Fred, who of course, threatened to kill Raina if he'd ever saw her again. Well, Raina did return to visit her daughters as often as she could, though she hated that Anne McFall had essentially taken her place as their mother, with Fred actually telling the children to call her mother. In October of 1966, Raina returned to Glasgow, but she was later arrested for stealing Fred's belongings, and she was returned to Gloucester to face trial. She was actually sentenced to 3 years probation. Isn't that some bullshit? So, by July of 1967, 18-year-old Anne McFall was 8 months pregnant with Fred's baby. Anne wanted Fred to divorce Raina and to marry her, but instead, she was suddenly gone. She just disappeared right out of the picture completely and totally out of contact with anyone, although a missing persons report was never filed for her. Curious. Well, we now know that Fred killed her, and he buried her near his home, first removing her fingers and toes. Some say it was to conceal identity, fingerprints, Some say maybe he kept them as trophies. Gross. So about a month after Anne disappears, Raina moved back in, and things between her and Fred seemed okay for a while. And a year went by, and then she finally drew up the courage to ask Fred for custody of the children. He, of course, said absolutely not, but Raina had had enough of Fred's bullshit, so she returned to Scotland, leaving the girls behind. I need to put on eyebrows, so I will BRB. So, fast forward to 1969. 27-year-old Fred met 15-year-old Rosemary Letts while waiting at the same bus stop several days in a row. Fred was immediately taken with Rosemary, and he tried multiple times and in multiple different ways to flirt with her, this teenager, but she wasn't having it. In fact, she was pretty grossed out by Fred. He wasn't very well kept. Fred did tell her that he was a single father of 2 young girls, and that did endear him a bit, but she definitely wasn't going to date this guy. Fred was tenacious, and he sent Rosemary flowers at the bakery that she worked at. Eventually, Rosemary did agree to go on a date with Fred. 15, 27, adult child. Gross. Moving on. Rosemary and Fred had a lot in common. We'll get to it. Within a few weeks, Rose actually left her job at the bakery to be a full-time nanny to Fred's 2 young children. Fred agreed to give her enough money every week to cover her salary so she could take it home to her family, because they weren't aware that Fred and Rosemary were spending time together. So, who is this Rosemary? Well, Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29th, 1953 in Northam, England. She was the 5th of 7 children to Bill and Daisy Letts. Isn't that interesting? Both of their mothers were named Daisy. Well, her father, Bill, suffered from severe mental illness, and Daisy was a severely depressed woman, and she underwent some electroconvulsive therapy while pregnant with Rosemary. So some speculate that affected Rosemary, gave her brain damage, so not a great start. As a young girl, Rose had severe developmental delays and educational delays, and she had uncontrollable fits of rage. She also did not feel emotions like shame or guilt or compassion or empathy. A lot of human elements just absent. Her brothers would later say that she was pretty hard to live with, and when she hit puberty, it got worse. She started walking around the house naked, and this was at a time when, she probably should have been a little bit more private. Rose would later report that her father was sexually molesting her. She would perform sexual favors for him in exchange for things that she wanted. Rose was also known to sneak into her little brother's rooms to molest them. Basically, Fred and Rose were like 2 pervs in the pod. Now, to their credit, if you want to say that, Rose's parents did not approve of their daughter's relationship with creepy-ass Fred. They threatened to call the authorities if they continued. So when Rose continued dating Fred, they ratted her out to social services. They also told them that she was engaging in sex work at his direction, which was true. Rose was placed in a home for troubled teens in the summer of 1969, but once she turned 16, she bailed out and she went straight to Fred. By February of 1970, Rose was pregnant by Fred, and on October 17th, 1970, she gave birth to a daughter that they named Heather Ann. So just 2 short months after the baby came, Fred was tossed in jail for 6.5 months because of some theft and fraud. So this left Rose alone to care for this newborn and Fred's 2 young daughters, Charmaine and Anna Marie. When Rose first started spending time with the girls in the early days of the relationship with Fred, she was kind and caring. After Heather was born, Rose started treating the other girls badly. Cruel, even. Anna Marie was generally pretty submissive, to Rose, but Charmaine fought back. So Rose was extra terrible toward her, On June 20th, 1971, Rosemary killed Charmaine.
Sorry, what?
Now, nobody knows how or what happened, but the day before was the last day that Charmaine was seen alive, and the next day, Rosemary went to Charmaine's school and removed her. She told the school that Charmaine's mother had showed up, to get her. She was living in London. Well, that's the story that she told everybody, even Anna Marie, who never understood why her mom came back for Charmaine, but not for her. A neighbor even stopped by to see the girls around that time, and Rosemary told them that Charmaine had, quote, gone to live with her mother, good bloody riddance. Rosemary actually stored Charmaine's body in the coal storage down in the cellar until Fred got home from prison. And once he got home, he moved the body outside to the back garden and buried it just outside the door. Well, in August of 1971, Raina showed up demanding custody of the kids, and this was the last time that Raina was ever seen alive. We now know that Raina was tied up, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death by Fred in the back of his car. After the murder, her body was perfectly dismembered and placed in plastic bags, and then buried at Letterbox Field near Much Marcle. Apparently, Fred had worked as a driver for a slaughterhouse a few years previously, and he was totally fascinated with how the animals were handled and butchered, and he learned everything that he could. It's also speculated that this is where Fred learned how to carefully disarticulate, cut at the joints, removing pieces, and this actually became a trademark of his kills. So, Fred and Rosemary. On January 29th, 1972, Fred and Rosemary were married in Gloucester. While Rosemary was pregnant with their second child that they later named May, this is when they moved into the 3-story home at 25 Cromwell Street. This is the house that most people are familiar with. This is the one that they have called the House of Horrors. I gotta say, I've heard of a lot of houses of horror. Fred did eventually buy the whole house, but at first it was kind of divided up. The private space on the ground floor is where the West family lived, but the rest of the house was converted into bed-sits. Basically, they just rented out the bedrooms to other people. Well, this did pay the bills, but Rose also supplemented the family's income with sex work from an upstairs bedroom that Fred had totally built out. It was like a sex dungeon, kind of. Well, Fred and Rosemary's marriage was obviously open. They were very sexually focused. They would regularly have threesomes, and they were very engaged in bondage and sadomasochism. They collected a lot of pornographic materials that eventually expanded into child abuse, sexual imagery, and bestiality. Rose's workspace was called Rose's room, and there was actually a red light in the hallway that would turn on when Rose was entertaining clients, so as to not be disturbed. The room also had several peepholes, secret peepholes that Fred would watch what was going on. He was quite the voyeur. And Rose was pretty rough with her clients, especially the women. She would partially suffocate them, and she would use extra large dildos.
In the event of a dildo, we have to use the indefinite article a dildo, never your dildo.
So over time, Rose's parents actually came to tolerate her marriage to Fred, and her father later went into business with Fred, opening a cafe that failed immediately. When Bill Letts learned about Rose's sex work business, he would visit her as a paying customer. I know, it's gross. And just like when you think that it's not gonna get grosser, it does. Fast forward to 1983. By this time, Rose had given birth to 8 children, with at least 3 of them being fathered by her clients. We already know about Heather and May, but then came Stephen, Tara, Louise, Barry, Rosemary Jr., and Luciana. Most of the children were eventually molested by Fred because he viewed them as his property, especially the ones that he fathered. The kids were all beaten by Rosemary, so much so that they were admitted to the emergency room 31 times over the years. It was so bad that Stephen and Heather eventually ended up running away, but when they came home, they were welcomed back with more beatings, attacked with knives, pots and pans, whatever Rosemary could grab. Anna Maria said that her first sexual experience was at 8 years old, when Rosemary stripped her down, walked her down to the basement, and Fred was waiting. Rosemary participated in this event.
Stop it.
When Anna Marie was 13 years old, Rose added her to her menu of client services, if you get what I'm saying.
Brother,
Fred and Rosemary West were truly depraved monsters. There was nothing that they wouldn't do, no line that they wouldn't cross. And although Fred might have been kind of the leader when they first got together, especially since he was much older, as the years went on, it became very clear that Rosemary wore the pants in that family. Let's back this up a little bit. So in October of 1972, Fred and Rose picked up a hitchhiker, 17-year-old Caroline Owens. So picking up hitchhikers and such kind of became something that the West did often. They would collect hitchhikers and they would seek out like wayward young women, vulnerable girls at bus stops, offering them a safe place to stay, a safe home, a ride in the car. Rose was even more of a predator than Fred because her presence as a woman made the girls trust them. This was a couple. You know, if a woman's here, I'm safe, but nay. Caroline, this hitchhiker that they picked up, actually moved into one of the bedsits and worked as a nanny for the West family. And Rose told her that she was a massage therapist, and this would explain this nonstop parade of clients coming to the house. Fast forward to Fred and Rose drugging her, and then they sexually assaulted her, they threatened to lock her in the basement to be a sex slave, and then they asked her to return to work as their nanny.
People don't forget.
Well, trapped and terrified, Caroline agreed, knowing that playing along with them was kind of the only way that she would have a chance of escaping, which she did. The first chance she got, she ran off, and she went home. She told her mom what had happened to her, and then they went to the police. So Fred and Rosemary West were arrested. They were charged with assault, indecent assault, bodily harm, and rape. And when the case went to trial in January of 1973, Caroline decided that she did not have the courage or the strength to face them, to testify against them. So the sexual abuse charges were actually dropped. It was all reduced down to like indecent exposure, to which the Wests paid like a 50-pound fine each. And that's it. They walked free.
Are you fucking kidding me?
So this, some might say, emboldened them to ramp up their depravity, as if they weren't already totally monsters. In April of 1973, the West tortured and murdered one of their tenants, 19-year-old Linda Guff. Fred dismembered her body, taking her fingers and toes, and buried it under the garage. 7 more victims suffered similar fates and were buried either in the back garden or in the cellar over the next year and a half. These victims included 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, 18-year-old Juanita Mott, 20-year-old Lucy Partington, 21-year-old Teresa Segan-Taylor, 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard, and 18-year-old Shirley Robinson, who was pregnant by Fred at the time, and 16-year-old Allison Chambers. So the older girl, Anna Maria, ran away from home in 1979, and this incestuous sexual abuse then shifted to daughters Heather and May. Fred was remorseless, saying, quote, "I made you. I can do what I like with you." Well, Heather and May tried their best to look out for each other, never leaving the other one alone with their dad. They would also only ever undress or shower when Fred was out of the house. Well, Heather did complain to friends and teachers at school about the abuse that she and her siblings were suffering at home. And she definitely showed signs of psychological issues, biting her nails, rocking back and forth in chairs, general nervousness around any men, never mind the bruises and welts that covered her body. Once Heather graduated from high school, she applied for a job in the tourist town of Torquay, but was rejected. Heather was devastated and cried all night. Killed Heather, dismembering her body, removing her fingers and toes, of course, and then they buried her in the back garden under the patio. They told the rest of the kids that Heather had gone to that job in Torquay, and when she never called or sent letters to them, they changed the story, telling the kids that she actually ran off and eloped with this lesbian in the red miniskirt. Fast forward to May of 1992. Fred, by this time, had begun regularly raping his now 13-year-old daughter, Louise. Rosemary, of course, was indifferent and dismissive, but Louise actually confided in a close friend who then told her mother, who then told the police. An investigation was launched and the West's home was searched, and then this is when they discovered this treasure trove of like sex paraphernalia and homemade porno tapes and all of these things. So Louise was actually interviewed by a very specially trained investigator who confirmed that these allegations were credible. That and physical exams were completed that confirmed, indications of abuse, sexual abuse. So the West children were removed and placed in social service care, and the Wests were charged with rape, child cruelty, sodomy, and obstruction of justice. Now remember, Anna Maria is out of the house because she had ran away, so when she learned of her parents' arrest, she contacted the authorities to provide her witness statement and agreed to testify against them at a trial. She also recommended that they speak with Heather, whom she knew was a victim, although they couldn't find her. Remember, she had run off. So in this very elaborate inquiry, they couldn't find records of Heather's existence. Like no employment records, no tax records, nothing. I mean, they didn't know it, but she was also, dead. Young Louise didn't want to testify in court, telling the authorities that she just wanted to go home. After learning of this, Anna Maria decided to retract her statement, fearing that Rosemary would harm the younger kids. But she did tell the investigators that her mother, Raina, and her half-sister Charmaine were also gone without a trace. So now it's early 1993, and the West children are still in foster care despite this criminal case against their evil parents kind of completely falling apart. And now we're back to the beginning. So the police dug around the West family home in the spring of 1994, specifically the garden. Following up on Fred's confession, he decided to give the police more information. Through his attorney, he sent a letter that read, quote, "I, Frederick West, authorize my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further approximately 9 killings, expressly Charmaine, Raina, Linda Guff, and others to be identified."
So y'all need to hide your kids, hide your wife, and hide your husband because they're raping everybody out here.
The police were blown away. They went from 3 to 12 murders. That changes things a lot. Fred was willing to assist the police in the search. He would help them find these victims. So he took them to the house on Cromwell Street again, and they went down to the basement. And the jovial and friendly Fred West used spray paint to show them where the bodies were buried. He also took them to their previous home on Midland Road so he could show them where Charmaine was, and they were able to dig up the floor and recover her body. So the search went on for weeks, and they were able to find the remains of 6 bodies buried there, confirming their identities with dental records. In addition to those victims, Fred also confessed to murdering Mary Bastham on June 6, 1968. He said she was a 15-year-old waitress that he had sexually assaulted and killed, and he buried her in Bishop's Cleeve, but they were never able to find her body, so he never actually was charged for that murder. Fred confessed to murdering upwards of 30 women. All of the victims were last seen between 1973 to 1975, and of the bodies that were recovered at the house, the forensic evidence, even though they were skeletons and it's kind of difficult to determine cause of death, there was evidence found buried with them that indicates that they were tortured. We'll just leave it at that. So, because of this note that Fred left, the police started to search for Raina and Anne McFall. And Fred again agreed to help the police, and he led them to Raina's body in Letterbox Field. But Anne's body wasn't as easy to find since the landscape had significantly changed over the years, but they did eventually find it. When they found Charmaine, they matched her dental records and used them to prove when she died, which was very important because Fred was trying to take total responsibility for everything, protecting Rosemary so that she wouldn't be found culpable. The timing of Charmaine's death proved that Fred couldn't have been the one to kill her because he was in jail, remember? Fred was charged with 12 counts of murder, and Rosemary was charged with 9 murders, later upgraded to 10. On June 30th, 1994, this was the first time that the couple had seen each other since Fred was arrested a couple months earlier. So Fred's lawyer, Howard, said that Fred kept looking at Rosemary and even reaching out, trying to touch her, but Rose wouldn't even look in his direction. Fred was crushed. By the end of that year, a trial date was scheduled for February of 1995. But on January 1st, 1995, Fred West was found dead in his cell, having hanged himself.
Oh no! Anyway, last week...
Well, of course, Rosemary West pled not guilty, and her 7-week trial began. So during this trial that outlined all this torture, rape, and murder, Rosemary claimed that she never even met these victims that were somehow buried in the cellar of this small home that she lived in with her children, although when she was shown the photographs of the victims, she turned bright red. Now, most of the evidence in the case was actually circumstantial, and Fred West, a potential witness, was now dead, so the Crown's case had to rely on witnesses. Many people that had lived or stayed at the Cromwell house temporarily testified to Rosemary's true personality and the activities that they witnessed in the house. Also, Caroline Owens testified about that abduction, torture, and rape that the Wests had done to her. Remember when they did that and then asked her to stay on as their nanny? She told the court that Rosemary was the aggressor. She was the one that was the most brutal. Well, the jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a unanimous verdict, and on November 22nd, 1995, Rosemary West was found guilty of 10 murders. And in the United Kingdom, the prison system is based on a rehabilitation model, so very few people are given true life sentences. Rosemary West became one of 3 women in the UK to be sentenced to prison for the rest of their natural life. She is currently serving her sentence at His Majesty's Prison at Newhall and continues to claim her total innocence. The surviving West children have struggled over the years, with the older kids attempting or completing suicide, and they have dealt with their own legal troubles and substance abuse and mental illness. The 4 youngest children were given new names to protect their privacy. And that is the story of Fred and Rosemary West. That was a lot. That was a lot. Disturbing. Layers. Just so many layers. If you want to know what makeup I used in today's look, then look down in the description box. Everything is linked. If I used anything that is old or unavailable, I'll find you something similar. If you have a Crue Trime story that you want to recommend to me, look down in the description box. There is a link to a Google document where you can click on it, fill in all the dirty details. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! This is gonna take 18 years to edit. Oh my God. Send help. What am I doing? Wow, nothing about this makeup looks good. And there is a hair on my face somewhere. I can feel it, and it is tickling me, and it's driving me crazy. Obstructing. Fred and Rosemary rest. While Rosemary... Oh my God, where the fuck is it? Excuse me. Child abuse can't say it. Accusations. Wow.